Aaron, I want to start with you. I want you to remind us what GitHub is for those of us who haven't used it as frequently as developers have, and then tell us what we know about this tool that OpenAI is working on.
Yeah, so GitHub is essentially a platform where companies can upload their source code and their developers can work together, in a collaborative way, similar to how people might work together in a Google Doc for us non-coders. And essentially what we learned is that OpenAI has recently gotten a bit frustrated with outages that GitHub has been having in the last couple of months, and is essentially looking at building their own platform where they can store their source code and work on it together, and hosting it internally. And we still don't know if OpenAI is thinking about releasing that product as something that it would sell to its own developer customers. That's something that they have been discussing internally as far as we know, but those plans could go either way at this point.
And so do we know anything about how far along they are in the product development process, or when this thing could be launched even?
As far as we know, this is pretty early. I think the soonest it would be ready is in the next month or so. But I think that they're still deciding whether this is going to be something that entirely replaces GitHub or whether it's just something that supplements that work. All of that is still unclear.
And Aaron, do we know anything about how they plan to differentiate themselves against a giant like GitHub?
So I think the biggest way they would do that is by combining this offering with their Codex coding agent. That's something that they sell to developers to automate the process of writing and editing code. And, Codex is powered by OpenAI's models. GitHub has its own GitHub Copilot product, which in the past has also mostly relied on OpenAI's models. So if this is something that, OpenAI can make a bit more cutting edge than GitHub Copilot and draw in users that are already using Codex to generate code and integrate it more with that product, that could, presumably be a way that they would differentiate it from the likes of GitHub.
So, James, you've been an engineer for your whole career. What do you think of this story?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Partnerships in technology often involve collaboration in some areas and competition and experimentation in the others. So I think the real interesting thing here is how is AI software development evolving, and what do the systems that need to support that look like? And that's the question that I'm wondering what the answer is here.
And in terms of your use of GitHub, I wonder how disruptive these issues that GitHub has been having has been for you. And ultimately, I wonder, what would OpenAI need to do to make its alternative compelling for someone like you to use instead of GitHub?
Yes, I think GitHub is a very successful platform. It's got a rich developer community and an economy around it. So I think it's going to be around for a long time. That being said, the way that we develop software is really evolving quickly. It's moving from people writing lines of code and files and working collaboratively to more of systems evolving. And I think that work will require some different functionality. So it makes sense that there would be a new intelligent layer that would pop up on top of the source control to help manage that. So it would need to be some pretty differentiating functionality to help scale these systems and run them effectively.
Any ideas on, now that you're in the seat now as a founder, you're designing products and stuff like that. I mean, what sorts of differentiating factors, what sort of features would you want to make this compelling?
Yeah, absolutely. So source control basically is a series of files. You can think of it as a file cabinet with where you store your code. Where it's going to is more complex problem solving and system evolution. So what maybe the repositories of the future might looks more of a system graph or a knowledge graph. And so I would need to see something that would support a higher level abstraction of this. Plus, there are other things that need to be taken into consideration as these software development flows evolve. Things like security and compliance and things like that, because AI is non-deterministic. You can't really, you can't depend on on the answer being correct. So feedback loops, different types of hooks into the system to allow these to get better will all need to be built on top of these repositories.
Aaron, as James talks about this, I wonder, the people you're talking to, the sources, Are these in the conversation of things that OpenAI is looking at, or are we still sort of unclear on that?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of, discussion in the developer community about how workflows need to change now that AI is playing a bigger role in creating and editing code. And, specifically, we have seen a lot of new startups pop up in the last year that are trying to solve this problem specifically. In fact, GitHub's former CEO, Thomas Domke, who just left in September, has just raised money for a new startup that is essentially trying to reimagine, how developers will interact with code in the future when maybe AI is writing all of their code and they don't actually need to look at the code line by line anymore. So I think there's definitely an appetite to sort of disrupt the GitHub model right now. I do think that, one big question for OpenAI, if they were to productize this, is, how do they convince companies to trust them to upload their source code into OpenAI's platform? Then again, we've seen a lot of companies have no problem using products like ChatGPT Enterprise to deal with sensitive company data.
James, how big of a challenge do you think that would be, convincing companies to upload their source code into an OpenAI platform?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're definitely seeing across the industry, companies are willing to take a little more risk. I think that the pressure of competition in building products faster and getting and higher quality is a thing. So I think it's hard to tell. I believe that there's probably areas where there will be more sensitivity across the code base. And so it may not be a black and white answer for each company. There'll be areas where they're comfortable with it and areas where they're not.
But James, one thing I wanted to understand, and Aaron, you pointed this out in your story, is it is somewhat common for companies to sort of develop their own internal tooling like this at companies like Meta, where you worked for a long time, right, James?
Oh, absolutely. So, getting back to why other reasons why they might be doing this is, we can map that to some of the same reasons that maybe we saw at Meta. And, it's no secret that we build our own source control system, mainly because the sheer scale of the system, it's billions of lines of code. GitHub just purely couldn't handle it. So look, if you're operating a very highly reliable business and you have a very large source base, you probably want to be in control of some of that so you can provide the reliability and the scalability that's needed.
Aaron, what do we know about how Microsoft feels about all this? One of OpenAI's biggest investors.
Yeah, so far we have seen that OpenAI is not afraid to compete with Microsoft. They have been increasingly, releasing products that they say can automate the work that white-collar workers might have previously done in Office, products that can create Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoints, for example. And I think that this is probably potentially, another front of that competition. Microsoft, of course, has also been branching out from OpenAI and has been increasingly striking deals with Anthropic and other competitors. So I think we're very much, in a world where these companies are maybe more competitors than partners, or at least, do both in equal measure. So I don't think that, Microsoft has any way of stopping OpenAI from developing products that compete with it. At the same time, I think it's safe to assume that Microsoft would be closely watching this and thinking about how it strengthens the pitch to developers that GitHub is still, the best place to use as a code repository.
And James, I just want to come back to you because some people listening to the show might not have as much technical expertise as someone who's been in engineering for more than 20 years now. But I just want to go back to the question of how OpenAI could make this compelling. If you were explaining those differentiating factors that you talked about to someone who wasn't in tech, you mentioned stuff like security, you mentioned stuff like context. Just bring it a little more high level to it. What could OpenAI do to make this compelling?
Sure. Well, I think one, it would need to, I think that it needs to evolve to be able to handle these new use cases. And again, I'm going to go back to the whole industry is experimenting with this right now, and nobody really knows where it's going to land. But I think that adding functionality that would address some of these issues that we've talked about, such as reliability and scale, I think adding an intelligence layer on top that allows us to step back a little bit from looking at things in the form of files, commits, and comments, And also, evolving the system to be able to understand the evolution of the more complex software systems, which is really where the work seems to be going. Writing the code was never really the hard part. It was really the evolving the system and understanding how it all fits and operating together. So an intelligent layer on top of that helps support that and evolve that would be pretty compelling.
Great. Well, Aaron and James, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Aaron Holmes, our Microsoft reporter, and James Everingham, the CEO of Guild.ai, here on TI TV.